Hi there. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Ryan Nobles in Washington, closing out a wild week for the White House as parts of President Trump's agenda were derailed and in some cases re-railed, with Republicans on Capitol Hill battling internal divisions in the Senate, and they basically lost control of the agenda in the House to Democrats, raising questions about how far Congress is willing to go to act as a check on the president with less than 5 months to the midterms. Right now, President Trump is in battleground Wisconsin, where he's set to participate in a roundtable discussion that's focused on agriculture. It's also where he's sitting down with Meet the Press moderator Kristen Welker for an exclusive interview for the show on Sunday. We'll have more on that in a moment. The president coming off a legislative win last night in the Senate, where Republicans passing the $70 billion fund to fund ICE and Border Patrol without any definitive guardrails to assure the Justice Department follows through on its promise to abandon the president's so-called anti-weaponization fund. Now, after that vote, Republican Majority Leader John Thune explaining why none of the attempts to include that language in the final legislation were successful.
What happened with these attempts to try to add amendments related to the weaponization fund? Why do you think none of them ended up being successful?
Well, we didn't have the votes. I think our folks understood what the mission was, and that was to get those two bills across the finish line and fund the border and law enforcement, and that everything else was a distraction.
Still, the weight of all the Republican pushback this week against the weaponization fund, the war in Iran, and the president's handling of the war in Ukraine is raising questions about how far some Republicans are willing to go to cross the administration. And looming on the congressional schedule is the confirmation of acting Attorney General Todd Blanche, who will likely still face heat from Republicans about the anti-weaponization fund. President Trump also needs Congress to pass reauthorization of a key surveillance tool after he appointed a fierce loyalist, Bill Pulte, to the top intel job. Now, Pulte's appointment is already facing outrage from both sides of the aisle, and President Trump adding fuel to the fire today, confirming reports that he told Pulte to fire staff within the office of the Director of National Intelligence.
Why do you want Bill Pulte to cut the office of the Director of National Intelligence, and how long is he going to be in that role?
Depends on how long it takes to get somebody approved. He'll do a very good job. He'll watch it closely, but Bill Pulte is very good. He's very talented.
You wanted to cut the number of people working there?
I wouldn't mind. I've heard that's way too high for way too long. Yeah, I wouldn't mind. If he cut, I wouldn't mind that.
Who are the people you're talking to for D&I? Can you give us some names?
5 different people. All very good, all people that you know very well, all people that do that kind of thing, and they're very respected people.
Joining me now is NBC News senior White House correspondent Gabe Gutierrez, who's traveling with the president in Wisconsin and where the president is set to speak. With me on set is NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Melanie Zanona. All right, Gabe, let's go to you first. We did hear from the president on his way to Wisconsin, and again when he got off the plane. What else did he say, and what kind of message can we expect from the president when he speaks behind you there in Wisconsin?
Well, Ryan, certainly this is a very competitive House district ahead of the midterms, one of the most competitive really across the country, and Republicans they feel they need to hold on to this seat, and that's part of the reason why the president is coming here today. He'll be speaking to farmers in this area just outside of Eau Claire, and the message we expect from him, Ryan, is to talk about the economy. Already, the president, in both opportunities, he's had to speak with reporters today aboard Air Force One, and also when he got off the plane, he has been touting those economic numbers, those stronger than expected job numbers that we heard about this morning. Also touting how gas prices have come down over the last several weeks, some 30 cents or so. However, the stock market, the Dow Jones took quite a hit today over fears over inflation, and that is something that the president and his administration feel that they need to try and sell the Iran war to the American people. So we expect to hear more from the president on that topic. Aboard Air Force One, you mentioned some of the things he talked about. He dismissed any concerns about Bill Pulte, his selection for acting D&I, and he also lashed out against Republicans like Tom Tillis, who are skeptical of Pulte's appointment, calling Tillis a very angry man. So certainly the president not backing down, even as he sees that increasing skepticism from some Republicans in the Senate, Ron.
Yeah, and Gabe, you mentioned it being one of the most competitive congressional districts in the country. We see Derek Van Orden, who is the congressman at risk there in that district, speaking to this crowd, riling them up. Let's talk about how the White House is feeling about the Senate passing that reconciliation bill last night without any language about the anti-weaponization fund. Is there still a chance? Is there an opening for this fund to come back at some point?
Well, look, at this point, you talk to White House officials, they not really talking about bringing this fund back, but you do hear the president himself kind of stoking those concerns among some congressional Republicans and, of course, Democrats. And every time he's asked about it, he says he loves the idea of this weaponization fund, seeming to go against his very own acting Attorney General, Todd Blanche, who told congressional leaders in no uncertain terms that this weaponization fund was, in fact, dead on arrival. Still, the president has been coming back and saying that he loves it and that he didn't back down because of congressional pressure, but only because a judge ruled against it, although a judge didn't really rule against it, just issued a temporary pause at this point. But so far from what we heard from the White House officials, no, they're not thinking that this weaponization fund will come back in any real form, at least for now, Ryan.
And you mentioned that the president is standing by Bill Pulte. But he also confirmed that he wants to act on Pulte's slashing staff. Is the White House at all concerned about other legislative priorities like FISA that could be at risk with Pulte's appointment and then any subsequent firings at the DNI's office?
Well, look, I just heard from a White House official on that topic, and their response is essentially to blame Democrats for any pushback they might get on FISA. They are trying to sell the Pulte nomination as best they could, trying to argue that he does have relevant experience. The president saying that he oversaw Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and so that somehow qualifies him to be acting DNI, although there is huge skepticism, as you know, Ryan, on the Hill, that he's any relevant national security background. But we did hear from the president when he was asked directly about this aboard Air Force One a short time ago that he wouldn't mind if Bill Pulte went ahead and slashed jobs in the intelligence community. So at this point, though, the White House doesn't think that will hold up FISA, and their tact on this, what they plan to do is really hit Democrats hard if there is any pushback on FISA at this point, Ryan.
Okay, Gabe Gutierrez, keep an eye on that in Wisconsin for us. We appreciate it. Let's bring Mel into the conversation now. And I want to pick up where Gabe left off there. Democrats, the White House blaming Democrats for the reason that FISA isn't being passed, but they have a real problem with Republicans right now on Capitol Hill. What's the mood like? We're certainly starting to see some of them push back a little bit, but as we saw last night, they ultimately fell in line. What's the next 6 months going to be like for Republicans?
I think it's going to be very difficult still for the next 6 months. Yes, the Yolo caucus did fall in line. They ultimately did not add any amendments that would have really rebuked Trump. But they are starting to light some fires. They're not burning the whole House down. But let's not lose sight of the big picture here. It was the pressure from Republicans that led GOP leadership to ultimately drop ballroom funding from the reconciliation package. They also had a lot to do with the fact that the DOJ announced they would be abandoning that anti-weaponization fund. Now, of course, we'll see whether that comes back now that there is no legislative binding to prevent the administration from resurrecting that fund. But I do think that some of these Republicans are really starting to use their voice, and we're going to see a lot more of that as we get closer to November.
Yeah, I mean, there's a big difference between passing something they wanted to pass anyway, as opposed to passing something with a bunch of stuff in it that the president wanted that they didn't necessarily want. We did hear from Senator Murkowski last night. She seemed to keep the door open to this idea that they might actually pass something that would prevent the weaponization fund from actually being implemented. Is that realistic at this point?
I'm still skeptical. There are certainly other Republicans who support that, who are concerned about the weaponization fund. You see that in Tom Tillis, Bill Cassidy, John Husted, Dan Sullivan, some of these members in really tough races. But as you know, on Capitol Hill, it's just very difficult to go through the normal legislative process to pass these bills if you don't have a majority of the majority's support, which is, at least right now, not what we're seeing. And so I think yesterday was probably their best opportunity to be able to pass legislation. That being said, I don't think it's an issue that's necessarily going away anytime soon.
And let's talk about some of the things that are on the horizon. They've got to confirm Todd Blanche as the next Attorney General. That necessarily won't be easy. They also have to renew this FISA Section 702. Given what we saw, how difficult could both of those things be?
I think they're going to be even more difficult than reconciliation. Reconciliation had the benefit of the fact that underlying all of it was this immigration bill that had a lot of support among Republicans. When it comes to both Todd Blanche as well as FISA, we're already seeing members come out expressing their concerns. Tom Tillis, he's a key member of the Judiciary Committee. He has already come out and said he has concerns about Ted Blanche as the permanent nominee. And then when it comes to FISA, Democrats, they're needed here because Republicans can't agree amongst themselves on FISA. So they have come out and said they're going to vote against this bipartisan deal if Pulte is still in the acting position. So there is a huge mess awaiting us and everyone else as we get back to Capitol Hill next week.
Yeah, probably the next 6 months is going to be a bit like this. All right, Melanie Zanona, thank you for that as always. Let's turn now to the economy and a labor market that is proving itself to be rather resilient despite the effects of rising costs from the war against Iran and high anxiety from consumers. The Labor Department reporting today that the economy created 172,000 new jobs last month. That was well above expectations. It's the third straight month the labor market has grown by more than 170,000 jobs. The unemployment rate holding steady at 4.3%. The White House today touting those numbers.
I think that basically what we're seeing is an enormous amount of positive momentum in hiring. Obviously, you're right that a couple of 170s in a row, that's a great couple of months, but then having upward divisions of around 100,000 means that this is a job market that's hitting on all cylinders. And it's our belief that this is happening because of all of the supply side policies that the president has put in place.
Now, today's news coming less than a month after the Labor Department reported that inflation in April hit 3.8%, its highest level in 3 years. And as the average price for a gallon of gas remains above $4.20 a gallon, that's according to AAA, up more than 40% since the start of the war with Iran. It was a brutal day on Wall Street, despite that jobs report. All three major indices down on the day. The NASDAQ tumbling more than 4%. President Trump posting on social media, with a great jobs report like just announced, stocks should go up, not down. That's the way it was for 200 years. Growth does not mean inflation. NBC News chief business correspondent Christine Romans joins me now. The president apparently trying to will the market in his direction. But we did get a wild day on Wall Street. And let's start with the May jobs numbers, though. Break down today's report. What does it tell us?
You know, this is a show that is watched by people who watch and follow politics. So let me put it in the political context here. The last 3 months of job creation were the best 3 months for jobs since Joe Biden was president. So look at that. Last year was not a great year for job creation. This shows you 3 strong months here. You saw Kevin Hassett say firing on all cylinders. A few things happening here. You've got tax benefits in the big, beautiful bill. That's helping companies. They are through the tariff uncertainty of last year. And in fact, many companies are getting millions of dollars back in tariff refunds and an economy that has just been resilient. And we saw this at the end of the Biden administration as well. No matter what kind of hit the economy took, it kept moving forward. You're seeing that, by the way, voters didn't believe that and voted Democrats out. But now you have kind of a similar situation. The jobless rate, 4.3%. That is enviable. And then here's the rub. You mentioned that 3.8% unemployment rate, or 3.8% inflation rate and 3.4% wages. This is purchasing power that is diminishing a little bit. Another reason why the consumer sentiment numbers are just so bad, Ryan.
And so let's turn now to this tumultuous day for the markets, especially the NASDAQ. Explain to us what happened.
So a couple of things here, but most importantly, they saw that strong labor number, those 3 strong months in a row and a 4.3% jobless rate. And remember, a lot of folks have been penciling in rate cuts to support the job market. This is not a job market that needs to be supported. So a lot of people thinking here the next move could be a rate hike, and higher interest rates, of course, hurt very fast-growing industries like tech, companies that take on a lot of debt. So that's why you're seeing that part of the market really move lower. That's an ugly number, by the way. A one-day move of 4%, that's a big move, Ryan. You haven't seen anything like that since, I think, April of last year. That was that Liberation Day tariffs when the markets just fell out of bed.
Mm-hmm. And as your numbers show us, inflation is up, consumer sentiment is down, but the labor market is resilient. How do you square those different numbers that seem to tell us different things?
Because companies are powering ahead here, and they're hiring people still. And one thing that is interesting to me about this number in particular, it means they're hiring, but they're not having to pay up for workers. So a couple of reasons there, probably AI. They're probably, the job market just isn't as gangbusters as it was maybe in 2024 when we were worried about it being too hot. It's good. It's good. It's very good. But it's not so good that it means wages have to rise faster than inflation. By the way, we're going to get another inflation report, I think, next week. And gosh, there are a lot of people I talk to think you could see a number more like 4% on inflation. So watch this space. This is the part of the economy that people are screaming about, the affordability part of the economy. Prices still rising. Gas prices have improved a little bit over the past few days. Hopefully they will in the days ahead as well, because oil prices fall today. But still, gas was $2.98 before the war began 4 months ago, $4.22 today. That's a big difference for family budgets and for business budgets. So that's still a drag on the economy.
Okay, Christine Roman, thanks for breaking it down for us. We appreciate it. As we mentioned, we do have a major programming announcement. Meet the Press moderator Kristen Welker sits down with President Trump today in Wisconsin for a wide-ranging exclusive interview. You can watch it this Sunday on Meet the Press and catch the highlights right here on NBC News Now. Coming up, Russian President Putin claims he's open for a compromise on Ukraine, but says he sees no point in meeting with President Zelensky. NBC speaks with a top Kremlin official inside Russia next. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Russian President Vladimir Putin says he sees no point in meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Those comments came during his remarks to the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, just one day after he told reporters that he was ready to make some compromises for a peace deal at the request of President Trump. At the request of President Trump, I should say, provided that Ukraine did the same thing. Joining me now is Chief International Correspondent Keir Simmons. He's actually in St. Petersburg. Keir, you just sat down with the Russian Deputy Prime Minister, a very important interview. What did he tell you?
That's right, Ryan. And we spoke to him immediately after President Putin had given that address and conducted that Q&A session for hours here in St. Petersburg. And you mentioned some of the things President Putin had to say after he rejected that face-to-face meeting with Zelensky. He then addressed Russian soldiers and said, "Keep going, brothers," underscoring this impression that the Russian leader believes that he's winning in Ukraine and that Russia can keep winning even if there isn't a negotiation. So I sat down with the Deputy Prime Minister, Alexander Novak, and I asked him how long Russia could keep going for. And he said quite simply, until President Putin's goals are achieved. He also dismissed the idea that Russia's economy is suffering. And I asked him, too, about relations between Russia and the U.S., because there are some here in Russia who believe that there can be a kind of a reset with the U.S. no matter what happens with Ukraine. That isn't what the Trump administration is saying. Alexander Novak, though, the Deputy Prime Minister, said, look, in the end, America walked away from us and effectively kind of put it on the table that the U.S., it was for the U.S. to decide whether to come back. Just one other point. He also said that oil prices higher have been helpful for the Russian economy, but that in the end, what Russia needs is stability. Of course, the world impacted by the war in Iran and by the closing of the Strait of Hormuz.
Mm-hmm. And how do Moscow and Kyiv view the role that President Trump plays in any negotiation? Is there a sense that the U.S. needs to play a part in this process?
Well, they both would like that, and certainly the Russians would like that. And in fact, President Trump's representative, Rodney Cook, was here and was sitting in the front row when President Putin was conducting that question and answer session. And then at one point, President Putin asked him to answer a question, and he looked like he was surprised. He stood up and he conveyed respects from President Trump to President Putin, and President Putin conveyed them back to President Trump. I actually had a chance to speak to Rodney Cook just before that meeting, and I asked him about Ukraine, and he said that he was hopeful. But of course, the comments that he then listened to from President Putin seemed a lot less hopeful.
Keir Simmons in St. Petersburg, Russia. Keir, thank you so much for that report. Up next, the president's agenda and the GOP-controlled House of Representatives gets taken over by Democrats on Iran and the war in Ukraine. A top House Democrat, Congresswoman Debbie Dingell of the battleground Michigan, is standing by with her reaction and what comes next. Keep it here on Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. House Democrats were able to push through a bill that would provide billions in military aid to Ukraine after winning over some of their Republican colleagues in what's being seen as a rebuke to President Trump's foreign policy agenda. 18 Republicans voted with Democrats to pass the legislation, despite objections from Republican leadership who said it would interfere with the president's efforts to end the conflict. The aid package, which also authorizes sanctions on Russia, now heads to the Senate, but stands little chance of becoming law since the president still has veto power over it. The vote comes just days after 4 Republicans broke with their party to pass a war powers resolution that was also backed by Democrats, designed to force President Trump to end the war against Iran, marking another Democratic-led rebuke of the president's foreign policy agenda in the House. Joining me now is Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Dingell of Michigan. Congresswoman, thanks so much for being here. We appreciate you joining us. Just in the last week, your party was able to pass a war powers resolution on Iran, a military bill to provide aid to Ukraine. These were all against the wishes of the Republican leadership and the president. But this was after enough of your Republican colleagues voted with Democrats. How do you read this? Do you think that there's actually some signs that rank and file Republicans are starting to assert themselves with not only their leadership, but the president himself?
So I think this is a complicated issue, Ryan. I think too many Republicans are still afraid of the White House and the retribution that he pays on those that cross him. But I believe there are 2 different issues here and we did take over the floor because we know and are listening to our constituents back home who have seen the cost of everything go up and rise. I think the Republicans that voted with us on the Iran War Powers Act 1 believe that the law says you need to come to Congress after 60 days. And they do believe in the rule of law. Some of those also are hearing from their constituents and are furious. They look at the price of gasoline. One of them was a colleague from Michigan. Gasoline in Michigan was over $5 several weeks ago. It's gone a little down, but it's still very high and now expected to go to $5 or $6 in the next few weeks. So they're listening to their constituents, and that this is going to get even trickier as they head to the elections. Ukraine, I think a lot of people are bothered by the lack of support for Ukraine right now. They want to see an end of this war. We know that food costs have gone up for several years. They were the breadbasket of the world, and I think that's why you saw more Republicans vote for this bill, because I think that as a democracy in this country, we believe in helping other countries that have a form of democracy.
I mean, do you think that there's any possibility that either of these bills could meet the same fate in the Senate? Do you think there are enough Republicans in the Senate? I know there are Republicans that support a check on the White House in terms of what's happening in Iran and Ukraine. Is this just going to be symbolic, or could we actually see this manifest itself?
So, look, we already know that there are a number of senators that agree with us, Republican senators, on the War Powers Act on Iran. And I think the longer this war goes for, the higher gasoline prices go up. You have seen oil companies warning us that gasoline prices could suddenly escalate very quickly, that it's going to be interesting to see who Republicans are listening to, the people that they represent, or a White House that's intimidating them. But you're right that the president could still veto it, but we have got to demand that the president come and talk to the Congress. On Ukraine, the parliamentary situation in the Senate makes it more complicated, but I do know that there are many Republicans who believe we should be helping Ukraine more than we are.
All right, let's talk now about the midterm elections. Democrats are hopeful not only about winning back the House, where you sit, but also taking back the Senate. But they're facing a problem with their candidate in Maine, in Graham Plattner, after more reporting from the New York Times last night detailing what they describe as unsettling interactions with ex-girlfriends, including physical threats. Now, Plattner's responded, acknowledging he was far from a perfect boyfriend, but he's proud of the work he's done since. Congresswoman, I know that you're someone that cares deeply about the issues of relationship violence and the rights of women in situations like these. Are you comfortable right now with Graham Plattner being the representative of the Democratic Party in Maine?
So I'm someone, as you know, that's very candid. I've spent my whole life. I lived in a situation where domestic violence was present as a child. I have been present and seen other women in it. You are correct. I've spent my whole life. So I'm not going to defend somebody with that kind of history. I'm a voter in Michigan. I don't vote in Maine. I know that there are also people who feel very strongly that there needs to be a check on the president. No, I'm not comfortable with that candidate. I'm not going to defend someone who has a history of violence against women. It's one of the issues that I'm the most passionate about in my life, and especially when they don't appear to even be sorry about it. But having said that, we also have someone in the White House that's got a history like that, and there does need to be a check. I'm glad I'm not voting in Maine.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important point you raise. Obviously, there is some concern among Democratic voters and elected Democrats that in some cases Republicans might be being held to a higher standard when it comes, I'm sorry, Democrats are being held to a higher standard when there have been Republicans in certain cases that have been elected despite similar accusations in their past. Do you think that's the same thing? Shouldn't Democrats want their candidates to be held to that higher standard as well?
Look, I am talking for myself, and I've always been very clear that violence against women and children, or even a woman towards a man, is unacceptable. I've lived in it. I know how scary it is. I know what it is to be afraid that you might die. So I am who I am, and I'm going to stand for what I've stood for all of my life. But I also know we have a man in the White House that has attacked women, and what we're seeing happen in this country is also deeply disturbing. I wish that there was maybe another candidate, and there is still one on the ballot on Tuesday, but I will not change who I am and defend somebody that has been violence against women or blames women for the way that they dress or that they are somehow responsible for violence against them.
Okay, thank you for being so candid about that, Congresswoman. You are not a voter in Maine, but you are a voter in Michigan, and you have a Senate primary there. There are 3 candidates that represent very different factions of the Democratic Party. You said last month that you were concerned that the primary was becoming very raucous and called for the candidates to tone down their shots at each other. Are you concerned that this type of divisiveness could cost Democrats that important seat in Michigan in November?
Look, Michigan's a competitive state, and that primary is a competitive primary. I have talked to every one of those candidates, and actually I've talked to every one of them again this week, that we are going to have to come together after this primary, that the tone that we are setting for the next 2 months could set a tone for what's going to happen in November. Michigan cannot afford to lose that Democratic seat. I remain neutral because my job is going to be to help bring everybody together. And as they are talking about the issues, they've got to remind people about what is at stake in November.
Okay, so you're not going to make any news with me right now then and tell me who you're supporting in this primary.
I am not.
All right. Well, I gave you that opportunity. I feel good about it. All right. Let's talk last before I let you go about just the state of the Democratic Party overall right now. It's off the back of this autopsy of the 2024 election, and now these new revelations from former First Lady Jill Biden's book that she actually was concerned about her husband's health during the campaign. A former Obama advisor, Dan Pfeiffer, says it's led to a broken trust between voters and the Democratic Party. You've been candid this entire interview. Do you agree that there's been a broken trust as a result of President Biden's decision, and how do you fix that?
Well, first of all, I'm going to go broader than that. I think there's a broken trust between voters and institutions, period. If you look, people don't trust either party, and we have to go out and we have to rebuild that trust. Look, I was around Joe Biden. I was stunned at what happened that night, but in my daily interaction with him, he was very attuned to the issues, and I had blunt discussions with him. But I think that all of us have got to go out and rebuild the voters' trust in us, and they need to see us deliver. I think a lot of people are very unhappy with what they're watching in Washington. They're tired of the divisive partisan politics. They're worried about the vitriolicness, the ugliness, the hatred that we're seeing, and we all need to understand the issues that they care about. They're all worried about affordability right now, and we need to go show people how we're going to make life more affordable for them, period, and do something about it.
All right, that seems like a good place to leave it. As always, great to talk to you, Congresswoman Dingell. We appreciate it. Enjoy your weekend.
Thank you, Ryan.
All right. After the break, we'll dig deeper into the latest allegations and controversies facing the Democratic Senate candidate in Maine, Graham Plattner, as we just talked about with Congresswoman Dingell, and the headaches they're causing for Democrats in Washington. Our panel is next on Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. As we mentioned, Democrats are grappling with a new controversy facing the party's likely nominee in a crucial Maine Senate race. In a lengthy report, the New York Times interviewed 3 of Graham Plattner's former girlfriends who described his behavior as toxic, unsettling, and at times physically aggressive. Last night, Plattner denying the most serious allegations while acknowledging his past problematic behavior.
There are some allegations in this piece that I just want to be kind of unequivocal about are simply not true. Anything alleging physicality, anything alleging that I knew what my tattoo was, these are the statements of someone who's politically motivated. There are things in this that I absolutely will take responsibility for and have been speaking about openly for months now. But those serious allegations are just not true.
At any point over the course of the past week, have you considered dropping out of the race?
No, not once.
The cascade of controversies has frustrated some Democrats, but seemingly not enough to try and sink his candidacy. Senate Democratic leadership sticking by him after a meeting on Capitol Hill earlier this week. And today, Congressman Ro Khanna, who is set to campaign with him in Maine this evening, also signaling his loyalty, saying, quote, "The behavior described in the New York Times story was wrong and toxic. Graham has acknowledged that and sought redemption. The people of Maine deserve a senator who's going to stand up to the billionaire class against genocide and for the working class." Joining me now is our panel. Sahil Kapoor, NBC News national politics reporter. Susan Page, the Washington bureau chief for USA Today. Megan Hayes, former special assistant to President Biden. And Matt Gorman, Republican strategist and an NBC News contributor. Yes, 4 people at the panel. We're calling it a super panel to end Friday. Sahil, you have done quite a bit of reporting about this race in Maine. Talk to us a little bit more about this Times report. I'm sure a lot of people have seen the headlines, but talk to us about what he's actually accused of and what he's actually admitting to.
Right. So essentially, the Times report is built on interviews with 3 women that he dated. 2 of them say that he drank a lot, that he was a bad boyfriend, that it was a toxic relationship. This he accepts. Graham Plattner has admitted that he was a bad boyfriend at the time. He said he went through a dark period. He had what he called undiagnosed PTSD, that he did self-medicate with alcohol in his own words, and that he's now a better person. A third one, and these are the most serious allegations in the piece, dated him over a decade ago when both of them were in their late 20s here in Washington. She says he sometimes got rough with her, that he grabbed her shoulders once, that once he tried to yank her out of a car by her wrist, that once he pushed her into a room and held the door closed. This he denies. He says this is all false. And he points out, and his campaign points out, that this is from a conservative activist. He argues that her claims are politically motivated. His campaign issued a pretty firm quote pushing back on this, calling her a lifelong GOP operative who spent her life trying to elect Republicans. They say that's exactly what she's trying to do now. So they're trying to discredit this woman who's making these allegations and argue that the rest of it is consistent with his prior story, that he did some bad things in his 20s and maybe early 30s, but he's a different person now in his 40s.
Right. But Susan, I think this is the vexing problem that Democrats find themselves in, right? Because they have said time and time again, we should believe women when there are situations like these. If you go through and read any of the comments, which I don't advise, but people do that, there are millions of people commenting, what about the Republican that's been accused of this? It's Democrats that have asked to be held to a higher standard. Should their candidates be held to a higher standard?
Well, maybe it depends. The Maine Senate race, crucial for Democratic hopes of winning control of the Senate. And the question I hear from Democrats is there more? Is this everything? We can deal with it in June. By the time we get to October, we'll be focused on other issues. Or will there be more disclosures that will be distressing? And I think that's a question that's hard to answer.
Megan, I'm sure you saw Congresswoman Dingell and how she seems clearly frustrated by this. Alyssa Slotkin yesterday had a similar reaction, saying that she's sick and tired of having to answer for men making bad decisions. How frustrating is this for the Democratic Party for this to be their standard bearer in Maine?
Yeah, I mean, I echo Alyssa Slotkin's sentiments as well. I'm sick of having to talk about it. I think that there's going to be more. These kinds of things don't just happen in a vacuum. But I don't understand why it wasn't disqualifying to have a Nazi tattoo in the beginning. So I think that this is a flawed candidate. Democrats are so desperate to win. We're doing exactly what Republicans did with Donald Trump, what Republicans are doing with Ken Paxton. And I don't want these people, I don't want any of these, Ken Paxton or Plattner in the Senate. They don't have the standards that I think our elected should have. So to me, I think it's really disheartening. I also think it's extremely disheartening to just discredit this woman just because she's worked for GOP candidates. I think that's gross and not a place that Democrats want to be.
Mm-hmm. So, Matt, obviously Maine voters right now seem to be digesting this, but most of the polling has shown that it really hasn't hurt Plattner's standing, at least with Democratic voters. But could this be an issue across the country? Are we going to see Republican ads tying Democratic candidates across the country to Graham Plattner?
Well, look, in Maine, I think Susan Collins is going to beat him like a drum, and I believe that even before the story came out yesterday. I mean, you're right. This was an incredible story with, abuse allegations and infidelity. Two of the other things I took away from it, besides he just seems to be a liar, is the fact that his comments that he did not dispute about if someone broke into his apartment, he would, quote, we would rape them, and it was about dominance, not sex. Incredible. What an egregious and awful statement to make. And the other thing is, to Megan's point, it's a further confirmation past the CNN article from a few weeks ago that he knew what the Nazi tattoo was and did not dispute that until he disputed it with Chris Hayes last night as well. And I think part of the anger you get from some in the GOP is we remember folks like what Sheldon Whitehouse did during the Kavanaugh hearings when he went 5 questions deep on what, quote, boofing was. And yesterday when stopped in a hallway, he said the story was a lot of nothing. And so it's the amorality on someone like his part when there's one standard when it was Kavanaugh in 2018 and quite another when it's Graham Plattner.
But do you think Republicans are doing the same thing here? I mean, what about, as Megan points out, the allegations against Ken Paxton? Is it in the same category?
Infidelity, I will not condone that, whether it's Graham Plattner or Ken Paxton. I haven't heard allegations of Ken Paxton abusing women. I haven't heard Ken Paxton going on Kick, which is, quote, called a paradise for child predators. I won't excuse infidelity, but I'm also not going to draw a line between Graham Plattner's abuse allegations and what Ken Paxton did either.
Okay. All right. Let's turn now and talk about what happened on Capitol Hill this week. We saw, in many ways, I wonder if there are people wondering if Hakeem Jeffries is the new Speaker of the House, because the only legislation that was passed in the House this week were 2 Democratic-led resolutions, one a war powers resolution and the other funding for Ukraine. We also have this issue with Republicans standing up to President Trump on Bill Pulte, who is his pick for DNI, and kind of holding up the FISA legislation. They're also angry about the reconciliation package and the anti-weaponization fund. Sahil, are we to the point yet where Republicans are getting a backbone, or do we still need some evidence that that's actually going to manifest itself?
I think we're inching toward that point, but moving at a snail's pace. And we can go case by case on these things. The war powers resolution that did pass on Iran in the House, that was after 3 failed attempts. The 4th attempt passed, and it passed narrowly, and it's symbolic. Even if it passes the Senate, it's a concurrent resolution, doesn't get to President Trump's desk. The weaponization fund, this was interesting. As many as a dozen Senate Republicans voted for some amendments to either ban that fund entirely or redirect the money. Those amendments failed. What did those Republicans do at the end? All of them except Lisa Murkowski voted for the bill. So are they trying to have it both ways? Maybe cast a vote or avoid taking a politically difficult vote that could haunt them in the election. But ultimately, they didn't do anything to disrupt the bill. It's going to the president's desk without any restriction, presuming it passes the House.
Which is not a guarantee. Yeah, right, yeah.
And then you have the issue of Bill Pulte. Now, Democrats are credibly threatening to block FISA if Bill Pulte is going to be the one overseeing that extraordinary power of warrantless surveillance. Republicans have made some noises in this direction, but TBD what they'll actually do.
So Matt, I think it's interesting. I think probably a lot of people at home don't realize how the calendar works here, right? But have we kind of entered a phase where President Trump's lost a lot of his leverage with the existing members of Congress? Because we're pretty much past all the Republican primaries where he would have the most influence.
It's tough, certainly when you have Cassidy and Cornyn feeling like they're a little bit more of a free agent and willing to buck the president on these things. It makes it much harder to govern the Senate for the next couple of months. And certainly if Blanche is not the only person who could potentially be confirmed. Cabinet secretaries leave all the time. Are we going to be in an area where there's just a lot of acting secretaries like we had at the end of Trump 1? That remains to be seen. I think this could get worse before it gets better, where you have a lot of folks working at acting titles and confirmations are harder to come by.
Yeah. And there's a lot still coming, right, Susan? We're going to have to pass a spending plan in September.
Traditionally, we try to fund the government.
That's generally
kind
at
of
least
old school.
It's like it's a goal, not necessarily one that is always accomplished. But there's also perhaps a war supplemental. There's a long list of things that need to be done. How difficult will it be?
I don't think President Trump cares very much about what Congress does or doesn't do. To the degree of a government shutdown, maybe that becomes annoying. But President Trump is very focused on leaving his stamp on the Capitol for when he leaves the presidency. He has entered that part of a traditional second term, maybe a little earlier than some others. What does he talk about when he has a chance to talk? He talks about the ballroom. He talks about the new Lincoln Memorial Promenade, which we had not previously been aware of. He talks about the enormous triumphal arch. And I think that says where his head is. So little cracks in the GOP coalition, but I don't think this is what's front of mind for the president.
And can Democrats take advantage of that going into the midterms?
Yeah, absolutely, because they're already taking advantage of it as you're seeing things pass that they want. But I also think that they're able to use the things that the president is saying, that he doesn't believe in the midterms and he doesn't care that people are suffering. Those are all going to be in ads of all the Republican congressmen that have supported him. Sorry, congressmen and women that have supported him leading up to this point. So I think it's a good thing for Democrats when he's out there talking about the ballroom, because it just makes them all look so foolish when people are really suffering in their districts.
But maybe I'll just put this out to the panel. Anybody can grab it. Maybe it's good for Democrats. Maybe they win one or both houses. But Donald Trump's in office for another 2.5 years. Are we really entering a phase where he doesn't care if he gets anything accomplished? Are Democrats going to fight him on every single thing that happens? Are we entering an era where it's going to be almost impossible to get anything done?
Yeah, well, I would reframe the question, right? Like, think of this as 2006 if you're George W. Bush, or 2015, close to that if you're President Obama. We're essentially we are in the second term of a Trump presidency, even though it's not consecutive. And so the accomplishments in the last 2 years, ostensibly, of a presidential term, relatively narrow, unless you have the bailout like what Bush did.
They still did the basic stuff, didn't they?
The basic stuff, sure. And I think you will get the basics. I think certainly the government will be funded and with a debt ceiling.
You sure?
We've been good so far. I mean, certainly it can.
We've had the two longest government shutdowns in history.
You know what?
Still funded.
You'll have oversight. Even if you just win one house, even if you just win the House and not the Senate, you will have oversight that President Trump has not had during his presidency, and that could make a difference.
And the president's actions lately suggest that he cares more about having a loyal Republican Party without anyone who's going to vote against him or cast votes against him or even speak out forcefully against him than he does necessarily by maximizing the numbers in the House, just based on his endorsements. The Texas situation is the best example. Republicans are going to have to spend millions, maybe tens of millions of dollars more than they otherwise would have to hold on to Texas with Ken Paxton than they would have with John Cornyn.
But I also think Democrats right now should take advantage of set themselves up for 28, right? So if they do take back the House in 26, they should be setting themselves up for 28. And that doesn't mean doing every oversight hearing just because you can. It means showing the American people you have solutions, because 28 is going to be a battle. Trump is not on the ticket. There's going to be 20 candidates, 20 plus candidates on the Dem side, probably 5 or 6 on the Republican side. It's going to be a slog, and Democrats need to have proof that they've done something.
And that'll take up the attention, right? That'll take up a lot more attention, as it always does, from what's happening in Washington.
It sounds like you're begging them not to impeach Donald Trump, if I'm reading between the lines. All right, we'll just take your grin as an answer to that question. The mega panel delivered. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it. Sahil, Susan, Megan, Matt, thank you all for being here. Still to come, we're breaking down a critical week for AI and policymakers in Washington amid new warnings and the fallout from OpenAI CEO Sam Altman meeting with top White House officials and skeptical lawmakers on Capitol Hill. That story's next. Stay with us on Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. We turn now to what's been a major week in the world of artificial intelligence and politics. OpenAI, the tech giant behind ChatGPT, says it will comply with President Trump's new executive order that asks AI companies to allow the federal government to review their models' capabilities before they're released to the public. OpenAI's CEO Sam Altman visited Washington earlier this week for meetings at the White House and Capitol Hill as lawmakers struggle to keep pace with the rapid growth of AI. Meanwhile, another AI giant, Anthropic, is calling for top tech companies to slow or even pause the pace of development and allow society to catch up with the AI systems, which they suggest are advancing so rapidly that they may soon be able to build on themselves without human intervention. Joining me now is NBC News artificial intelligence reporter Jared Perlo. Jared, thanks for joining me. You're somebody that follows this extremely closely. How concerned should we be by Anthropic's warnings?
Well, I think we should be somewhat concerned. So I think zooming out, it's obviously in the AI companies' interest to say, oh my gosh, the AI systems will start building themselves, right? Because that says their products are really capable. But I do think there's a lot of truth behind this. So Anthropic, which manufactures the AI system called Claude, which maybe people are now increasingly familiar with, they said in a blog post released yesterday that 80% of the code that they now upgrade into their actual systems, the systems that we consumers interact with, 80% of that code is written by AI. So there's now a kind of cyborg human AI fusion happening inside these leading AI companies. And what they're concerned about is that if we do get to a point where, because of competitive pressure, more and more of that AI development is outsourced to AI systems themselves, maybe we'll enter some sort of flywheel situation where we can't control exactly what's going on. However, they also note that because there are these competitive pressures, it's not really in any one company's interest to stop that process. So what they say is there should be at least some sort of mechanism for these companies to coordinate between themselves, both in America and China globally, to make sure that we don't enter those sorts of terrifying race dynamics. That's, I think, a lot easier said than done, and they say they're going to be working on building out what that could actually look like in the coming months. So I think really important to stay tuned there.
Yeah, it comes on the heels of this new executive order on AI. What's the reaction been from tech companies?
So tech companies largely really have reacted positively to this executive order. So it's been in the works for months, really a reaction to this release from Anthropic of a new model called Mythos, or Mythos Preview, which discovered thousands of new critical vulnerabilities in various software packages in systems like Windows and the Mac operating system, so things that we interact with every day. Tech CEOs say it's about high time that the government is getting involved in making sure that AI systems are safe for the American public. I chatted with IBM's CEO just 2 days ago. He said, thank goodness President Trump finally signed this. He was supposed to sign it several weeks ago, but pulled it at the last minute. So I think, the AI system has been calling for some sort of regulation for years now, but Capitol Hill is stymied in its own way. And the Trump administration, on its first day in office, actually repealed an executive order that President Biden had passed. So I think everybody from the tech side is now happy that there's federal involvement. There's lots of disagreement about whether that involvement should be mandatory, voluntary, and what exactly should be happening on the inside of that. So that's still a live issue. But I think we're now in a situation where the tech CEOs say, well, better something than nothing.
Okay, Jared Perlo, thank you for breaking that down for us. We really appreciate it. And the former CIA officer accused of stashing millions of dollars worth of gold bars in his home will remain in custody. A federal judge ordering David Rush to continue being held at the Alexandria, Virginia detention center until he stands trial. Rush, who worked on one of the U.S. government's most highly sensitive programs, appeared in court this morning. He was arrested last month after the FBI raided his home, allegedly finding more than 300 gold bars and $2 million in cash. NBC News legal affairs reporter Gary Grumbach has the latest from Alexandria.
Hey there, yeah, David Rush, that senior CIA officer detained pending trial in this case after Magistrate Judge William Fitzpatrick here in Alexandria, Virginia, saying that due to the unique nature of David Rush's job, he is particularly suited to potentially flee the country, to potentially be a danger to the community, and because of that, he must be detained pending trial. This is a win for the Department of Justice, who the attorney there today called him a master manipulator, saying that he lied about a number of things over the past 20 years or so, saying that he's told people he was a doctor, which he is not, saying he told people he was a pilot, which he is not, saying he committed, quote, tremendous fraud over the past 2 decades. Rush's attorney, Jessica Carmichael, saying this is a case that involves just one charge, theft of public money, related to timesheets that were incorrectly, in her words, filled out over the past few years. Nothing to do with gold bars, nothing to do with lying about his career, and because of that, those issues shouldn't factor into whether or not he is detained pending trial in this particular case with the charge that is currently against him. There is one thing both sides do agree on, however, that is that every gold bar that Rush allegedly took from the CIA has been accounted for. That's what the government said, that's what Carmichael said, so that is some news out of this hearing today. So in this case, David Rush will stand trial. In this case, he will be detained pending trial. Back to you.
Okay, Gary Grumbach, thank you for that report. And we, of course, will be back Monday with more Meet the Press Now. And if it's Sunday, it's Meet the Press on your local NBC News station. As we mentioned, Kristen will have her exclusive one-on-one interview with President Trump. You won't want to miss it. But there's always more ahead on NBC News Now. Thanks so much for watching. Have a terrific weekend.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.